everybody, and welcome back to the channel. With today being the 18th of June, there can of course be only one topic that we can talk about today, and that of course is the coronation of the Chinese governor Li Yuan as Emperor Gaozhou of Tang, the Emperor of China. No, I'm joking. It is of course the Waterloo Day, although it's also actually the 18th of June is the day that the US formally declared war on Great Britain, starting the War of 1812, which, as regular listeners to the channel will know, I consider very much to be part of the Napoleonic Wars. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. Today we are, of course, going to talk about the Battle of Waterloo. And I thought we'd have a nice, uncontroversial video today, which is the 5 reasons why Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. Now, I should really title this My 5 Reasons Why I Think Napoleon Lost the Battle of Waterloo. But hey, we live in a capitalist world and I need some clickbait, so I'm going to title the video The 5 Reasons Napoleon Lost the Battle of Waterloo. If you have listened to my 5 points, if you think there are other reasons or you disagree with some of the reasons I've given, then please pop it down in the comments down below. Genuinely, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this. It's a subject which has had no small amount of ink shed upon it, so I'd like to see what people think. I want to go straight in at number 1 with an interesting one. It's something that I only really found out quite recently, and that was the people Napoleon took on campaign with him on the 100 Days. And I'm talking about 2 people specifically here. One I think is going to be probably fairly uncontroversial, and one I think some people might be more interested in, shall we say. The first one is, of course, that Nicolas Davu, the Iron Marshal, he was left behind in Paris by Napoleon. He had returned to the Eagles, but Napoleon had decided that he would be better off being Governor General of Paris. And this, I think, was a major mistake, because Davu was one of the few French marshals who had operated successfully independently of Napoleon's command. It was he, of course, who took part in the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt. He commanded his corps in Auerstadt, and that was where the majority of the battle was won. That's where most of the Prussian troops were attacking. So he had some pedigree in operating independently, and I think had Grouchy been replaced by Davu, then I think there would have been a very different situation when pursuing the Prussians. Speaking of Grouchy, he was made a marshal for the 100 Days campaign. I think that was a mistake. Now, I've made some videos before memeing on him, but I don't actually think he was that bad. They were memes. They were for fun. But I would say I don't think he was really the man for the job. If you'd have had Davu in command of the corps that was eventually given to Grouchy, then I think he would have been more successful. And Grouchy, he could have stayed back in Paris, or for my money, he wouldn't have even been elevated to a marshal at all. That would have gone to Damme, Dominique Damme, not Jean-Claude, Dominique Damme, who I think was a much better infantry commander. But I say he was a better infantry commander. That's not entirely fair on Grouchy, because he was a cavalryman. But I think Damme would have been a better marshal at Waterloo. He certainly would have done, I think, a better job on the field than perhaps some of the others did. I think if Damme had been in charge of 2 corps, the troops who were opposite Hougomont, I think that may have been a very, very different fight. Jerome was not really a battlefield commander, so for anyone who doesn't know, the 2nd Corps was under the command of Prince Jerome, Napoleon's brother, not really a hardened battlefield commander. That is absolutely something you cannot say about Damme. They didn't come much more hardened than him. So the first point is, I think he had the wrong personnel in the wrong place. The second point really sort of feeds into that, and that is that the quality of his subordinates was just not high enough overall. So it's all well and good having a Davu or a Damme in place, but if your brigade commanders and your divisional commanders aren't quite up to it either, then you're going to be in a really, really sticky situation. The British, on the other hand, they had superb divisional commanders. I'm thinking people like Picton, even people like Uxbridge. We talked about the command of the French 2nd Corps earlier on, not quite being up to snuff, while the commander of the British 2nd Corps was General Hill, an absolute veteran of the Peninsular War. So I think there was a quality that the British had that the French just found lacking. And I think that was due really to war weariness. I think that's been no more evident than in the conduct of Marshal Ney during this battle. While Napoleon was the overall commander, it was Marshal Ney that was putting those plans into action. And he wasn't really the same man who he had once been. He was certainly not the man he was in 1800 or 1805. I think Russia really did change him, and obviously he'd originally gone to bring the monster back to Paris in an iron cage, and his men turned and sided with Napoleon. So one has to wonder how much he was actually into the whole return of Napoleon thing. Now, that said, I don't think that he undermined him. I don't think he deliberately underperformed in order to make Napoleon lose, but one has to wonder if his heart was actually really in it in the first place. So while there's an argument to say that a lot of the subordinate commanders did have battlefield experience, they were weary, they were worn down, they didn't have the confidence that comes with being a victor in a war, and I think that's something that the British absolutely did have. And we've not mentioned them yet, but the Prussians, they had a different method for the quality of their officers. It was due to the excellent staff work put in place by Generals Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and also the driving force of Blucher as well. The French had long had the Elan beaten out of them by the tough conquests and the tough fighting that they had for certainly the previous 3 years, if not the previous 15. When I look at the army of 1815, the Army of the North, it just doesn't have the same style, the same flair that those early French Napoleonic armies have. And I think that's one of the reasons I think I mentioned this in my video on why I don't like the Battle of Waterloo being so prominent in Napoleonic wargaming, is because the French are somewhat of a rather bland force by then, if I can say that. And I don't just necessarily mean colours-wise, but also tactics-wise and style-wise. I'm not sure if I'm getting across what I'm meaning to here, so I'm going to leave it there. But basically what I'm trying to say is I think by 1815, the French didn't have the drive that made, particularly the early armies, the revolutionary armies, the successful armies that they were. So having brought up the big man himself, the man who thought he was made pregnant by an elephant, I'm not really sure why, we also come to point number 4, which was Marshal von Blucher and the Prussians in general. I think Napoleon very much underestimated the Prussians. He'd obviously absolutely destroyed them in 1806. We were mentioning about the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt earlier on. But the army of 1815, the Army of the Rhine, was very, very much not that 1806 army. Now, I love the Prussians in 1806. I've got a bit of a soft spot for them. They are complete rubbish. Possibly even worse than the Spanish, although I don't know about that one. But the army of 1815, any of you who see my video on the best armies of the Napoleonic era will know that I actually placed them at number 1. I think the Prussian army of 1815 is the first modern army. And for that reason, even were Napoleon to be near his best, then I think he'd struggle to beat them. I think it would be impossible for Napoleon at his best to beat them when they are fighting alongside the British. Now, the British at Waterloo had all of their Peninsular War veterans and also a number of veterans from the War of 1812. They were a finely honed army. They were arguably the best army that Britain has ever fielded, and we fielded some pretty good armies in our time. As mentioned in part 3, we had the command element, the veterans of the Peninsular War, both in the ranks and in the senior ranks. But the thing that makes Britain, or the British Army of 1815, slightly lesser in my eyes than the Prussian Army was the quality of the staff work. We didn't quite have the staff work that the Prussians had. We had much better intelligence, but the staff work wasn't quite as good. And last but not least, point number 5, why did Napoleon lose the Battle of Waterloo? Point number 5 is quite simply is Napoleon. I think Waterloo must count as one of his worst performances on the battlefield. It was simply just head-on battering himself against the British. He tried that at Borodino against the Russians, and it kind of worked. They did win the Battle of Moscow after all, but it was with massive casualties, and it was a very different situation. On the road to Moscow, the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon was on the offensive. He was looking to take, well, it wasn't a Russian capital, but it was the center of Russian identity, the heart of Russia, one could say. And that's what he was looking to take. When he was marching towards Brussels, what was his end goal there? He could have taken Brussels, he could have defeated the British, he could have defeated the Prussians. But then what? The Austrians are on their way, and more importantly for him, the Russians are on their way, with Alexander at their head. So it's very Napoleonic for a coup domain, and I mean Napoleonic in the sense of Napoleon, to stage a coup domain, to try and break the two armies up before they can converge. It's classic tactics, it's still a valid tactic today. But Napoleon never really appears to have been fully convinced by it in this stage. It's the kind of tactic where if you do, you go balls out. There's no point in messing about. If you're going to overwhelm one enemy force before it breaks with the other one, you can put out a very small covering force. An entire corps, no chance. You've got to really hammer it with as much force as possible. And this he did not do. We also mentioned that Marshal Ney was in fact the chap giving the orders on the battlefield. So while the men were fighting under the gaze of the Emperor, they weren't fighting under his direct command. And one really has to ask, why was Napoleon doing this? Now you could say, well, he had his eye on the strategic level, whereas Ney was taking care of the tactical decisions. And that's absolutely fine. That would work well. That's basically how modern commanders work. However, this doesn't seem to be the case, because he had absolutely no idea where Grouchy was, and he was unable really to counter the Prussians. He sent the Young Guard into Place Noire to fight them, but, I mean, while the Young Guard weren't his last line of reserve, that was the Old Guard, we'll come to them in a bit, then they were still a unit that you didn't really want to waste in urban skirmishing. The Prussians, who arrived fairly early on in the day, about 12 o'clock-ish, really began to drive in on Napoleon's flanks, and he didn't really increase his sense of urgency to break the British on Mont Saint-Jean and then swing round to attack the Prussians. He just sort of kept on going, doing what he was doing, really. If he was so disappointed with Jérôme throwing his men against Hougomont, why didn't he go over there and sort it out himself? Now, here's an interesting parallel, and it goes more into why I think Napoleon was the main reason why Napoleon lost the battle. Is a sort of quirk of history, I guess, is that Wellington and Napoleon were almost exactly the same age. They were born about 6 months apart. I can't remember which way round it was. Now, admittedly, Napoleon was not in great health, but Wellington was galloping up and down the lines. He seemed to be everywhere, as one of the quotes was. Napoleon was nowhere to be seen, by contrast. I don't want to say that he was lazy, but he certainly wasn't as active as he could have been. And another example of this was after the Battle of Linney. So if we're going to take the 100 Days campaign as a whole, I'm going to expand it out a little bit here from just Waterloo. The Battle of Linney was fought on the 16th of June, as was the Battle of Quatre Bras. Both victories for the French. Linney actually quite a strong victory for the French. That was on the 16th of June. The 17th of June, Napoleon just hung around Linney. Like, what are you doing, man? This is supposed to be a lightning-fast coup domain. You'd humbugged Dwellington, to use his term, by stealing a march on him. You've got the advantage, and then Napoleon just stands around and throws it away through inaction, really. Napoleon that I've read about, this is the man that said, "You cannot defeat me. I spend 30,000 lives a month." Resting his men and making sure they were all nice and toasty, that's very much not Napoleon. Again, a more hard-marching marshal, someone like Damme, may have said, look, we're going. He was under Grouchy, and he was urging Grouchy, march to the guns, join the main battle, and Grouchy overruled him on it. Imagine if he had been the guy who was saying to Napoleon, we need to go now. And we saw at the Battle of Wavre that when he was given his head, he actually managed to do great things, and the Prussians lost that battle as well. Napoleon also had a hugely inflated opinion of himself, and that went in hand to hand with having a derogatory opinion, particularly of Wellington, who he declared to be a sepoy general. Now, I know there's a lot of Prussian fans out there who like to bag on Wellington, but he was an excellent commander. Of that, there is no doubt. And as I said earlier, despite being the same age as Napoleon, he still had a lot of energy and a lot of life left in him. It was a good performance on the day from Wellington. It was a very, very poor performance from Napoleon. And finally, another reason why I think Napoleon was to blame is the situation the day before. Now, Napoleon, he was a very great man, but he could not control the weather. They had a storm the night before the battle. Famously, Napoleon, some people dispute this, but it's said that he wanted the ground to dry out in order for his guns to be more effective. I'm not sure how true I believe that to be. I mean, the British are going to be in two deep line. I mean, if you're firing ball, it's not going to be great anyway. I'd imagine the vast majority of the French artillery would have been ball because they had ball, but the shell would have been far more effective. So by waiting for the ground to dry out, he allowed Blucher more time to come in and outflank him. And again, it goes back to the lethargy. That's the word I've been looking for throughout this whole thing. Napoleon was lethargic. He didn't have the urgency that is required certainly in modern warfare, but even in warfare then. This had to be a quick, hard, fast strike, the tip of the spear, and he wasn't physically capable of doing it. I'm not sure about mentally, but physically he didn't seem capable of doing it. So those are my 5 reasons why I think Napoleon didn't win the Battle of Waterloo. The first one is his personnel choices. The second is the quality of the personnel that he had available to him. The third one was that he didn't really seem to have a plan. He didn't really know what he wanted to do. And with that, it's very difficult to really formulate a strategy, particularly one that relies on speed and impact. Fourthly, one of the things that is difficult when you rely on speed and impact is when you're fighting 2 of the best armies in the world, if not 2 of the best armies of all time. And the British and the Prussians of 1815, very strong opponents. And then finally, Napoleon himself, he wasn't at his best. In fact, he was far from his best. There were a number of decisions he made, both campaign-wise and in the battle itself, that just people have debated them for the 2 centuries since because they just seem so bizarre. There's a lot of room for interpretation there. So those are my thoughts. I'm interested to see what you guys think. Why do you think Napoleon didn't win the Battle of Waterloo? Now, I've titled it this way because it's not necessarily why he lost, but why he didn't win. I think those 2 things sound very similar, but they are a little bit, there's a subtle difference there. Because if we're looking at why he lost, then we need to look at the tactics of the other 2 sides. So I want to keep this quite French-centric. I can always do the other sides in future videos as well. So if you'd like to see that, let me know in the comments down below. I very rarely actively link videos, mainly because I forget. But I'm going to put in here two links to videos I've done. One is on the Prussian Army of 1815. That's part 5 of the Prussian series. If you've not watched that series, then I can highly recommend it. And the other one is going to be why I think Waterloo is bad for Napoleonic wargaming. Don't worry, there is a counterpart of why Waterloo is good for Napoleonic wargaming, but I can only list one of those, and I think that's the more likely that people are going to click on. But thank you very much for watching. Have a lovely Waterloo day, everyone. And for my Chinese listeners, enjoy Li Huan Emperor Gaozhou Day as well. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.